Hi, this is Miss Klemme and welcome to the video on cell transport variations. What you see right here is a variation of cell transport. There's, to orient yourself, there's a cell membrane, a phospholipid bilayer. We can see the cytoplasm in the inside, the extracellular fluid on the outside. And basically, this is a pump. This is a channel protein called the sodium-potassium pump. It's found in probably almost every cell in your body, but specifically it's used in your nervous system. It's used in order to reset your nerve cells so that they can continue to send and receive messages. And so if this isn't working, you can't reset your system, you can't receive new messages, and you wouldn't be able to move. And so basically what it does is this membrane protein pumps out a bunch of sodium from the cytoplasm out into the extracellular fluid, and in exchange it swaps the potassium and brings the potassium into the cell. And in order to do that, in order to run the pump, it requires energy in the form of ATP. So that's one variation of cell transport. Now let's kind of backtrack a little bit, and what does it mean to transport? Well, remember the plasma membrane is the main organelle, if you will, that's responsible for that. And so we have lots of things that have to go in, just like in the sodium-potassium pump, we had sodium. And a lot of things have to go out, just like potassium did. And so, oops, I think I actually had these swapped, my bad. We have potassium and we have sodium going out. But in the end, the cell membrane, the plasma membrane, is the thing that's responsible for regulating what goes in and what goes out. For example, sugar can go in. Proteins in the form of amino acids can go in, so the cell needs that. Water needs to go in, but the cell also makes waste in the form of salts, in the form of ammonia. And so the cell membrane has to be somewhat cautious in what it lets in and out, so it's selectively permeable, and it only has certain channels for certain things, because very few things can just go straight through the membrane. So here's an overview of what we're looking at today. We have two main categories of cell transport. There's passive and active. And within each, there are a couple different types. Diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion fall under passive. And the ion pump, like the sodium-potassium pump, is active, as well as endo and exocytosis. So let's begin with passive transport and active transport overview. For passive transport, the biggest thing and the biggest difference between active is that there's absolutely no energy requirements. And whereas active does require energy, and you can see it in the diagram, it's in the form of ATP in order to use those pumps. The other thing you'll notice is that passive doesn't require energy because molecules are usually going from where they're very highly concentrated, such as in diffusion, to where they're very lowly concentrated. On the other hand, active transport is when you are going from low up to high, and so that requires energy to go uphill. If we look at the differences then between diffusion and facilitated diffusion, so they both are doing the same thing. They're moving molecules from high to low through the membrane, but diffusion, those are really small molecules. They can just go through, like carbon dioxide and oxygen can go straight through. But there are some molecules that require a specific channel protein to get through. For example, water would be a case where they would need a channel to get through. And then down here, active transport, we're going from where there's not a lot to where there is a lot, and we require energy to do that. So again, if we want to recap a little bit different way to look at the types of diffusion, this would be simple diffusion where those molecules can easily squeeze through the membrane until we reach equilibrium. In the case of facilitated, they would just need a special little channel protein to get through, but they can still fit essentially. In the case of osmosis, the last type of passive transport, it's the same as diffusion. They want to reach equilibrium, but in this case, the particles can't fit, and there's not a specific channel for them. And so water will go through those channels and try and reach equilibrium. So in the scenario where there's a hypotonic solution, that means that the cell must be a hypertonic solution. And so water is trying to enter the cell to make it reach equilibrium just based on concentrations. In an isotonic solution, the solution concentrations both in and out of the cell are roughly the same, and so the rate of water entering and leaving stays about the same. In a hypertonic solution, that means the inside is hypotonic. And so this would be like if you plopped one of your cells in the ocean, what would happen? Well, your cell wants to try and reach equilibrium, and so water is constantly leaving, and that cell will lose lots of mass. And so that's a look at the different types of passive transport. Now on to active. Earlier we said it requires ATP, it requires energy because you're going from where there's not a lot to where there's not a lot to where there is a lot. And sometimes that's not always the case, but in the case of this, where there's a specific channel protein, this is an ion pump, and they're not necessarily always going against the concentration gradient. Like where you see we do have a lot here going to where there's a little, which would seem like diffusion, but sometimes these naturally don't go where they need them to go, so we have pumps that make sure they get to where they need to go, kind of like a doorman. These things have to fit into the correct pump, and then the pump lets them in. The other types of active transport are used for bulk flow, big quantities of materials either entering or leaving the cell. In the case of leaving the cell, we have exocytosis. I always remember that as exiting the cell. And so you see here a little vesicle carrying some, say, maybe proteins the cell made. And those proteins have to get into the bloodstream and go to other cells where they can be used. And so this vesicle slowly moves closer to the cell membrane and fuses with it, expels its contents, and that requires energy to do that. On the other hand, the opposite of exocytosis is endocytosis, which is engulfing or taking in bulk quantities. In the case of phagocytosis, you can see the cell membrane literally forms a little vesicle around it, and it eventually seals off into a vesicle. And the consumption of solids is known as phagocytosis. But the same can happen here, where we have a little vesicle that was created to take in large amounts of liquids. So that's a look at passive transport and the three types, as well as active transport and those specific types. I hope you found that helpful.